So you'll notice that in a few recent videos I have talked at length about Paul McGann's portrayal of the Doctor. Brought to life in the 1996 TV movie, McGann's version of the character became a fan favourite over the years, thanks in part to not just his written adventures, including the 8th Doctor Adventures books, but also the love he's received through Big Finish, including the companions he received, these being the likes of Charlie Pollard and Lucy Miller, and countless others. However, it was entirely possible for Paul McGann to return even sooner than he did, at least on screen. During the wilderness years of Who, specifically after 1996, there was still quite a bit of uncertainty over what was next for Doctor Who. A potential US-produced reboot sadly did not come to fruition due to the TV movie's overall viewing figures. However, let's look into an alternate timeline, one where instead of Christopher Eccleston's 9th Doctor, the 2005 revival instead saw the return of Paul McGann as the 8th Doctor.
The multiverse is a pathway to many possibilities that some might consider unnatural.
Okay, before we can get into the actual scenario, I think it's appropriate to establish some backstory on the showrun territory first. Now, reviving Doctor Who in 2005 was not going to be an easy task. Russell T Davies, who at the time was known for his work on the TV show Queer as Folk, had his name down for taking on a task this monumental, and given where his run of the show ended up, at least the first one, and given where Who is today, successful or otherwise, I would say that he has done a quote-unquote decent job at bringing the show back. However, prior to Russell signing on, there were a few other names up for consideration. Among these were Matthew Graham, the co-creator of Life on Mars, who had pitched a more gothic adaptation of Who. Daniel Friedman pitched a fantasy retelling, and now Doctor Who veteran Mark Gatiss pitched an unusual idea of making the Doctor the audience surrogate, a position that over the past 60 odd years had been usually held by the companion. However, that then brings us to the question of why did Paul not return for the revival in 2005? Well, it mainly came down to the fact that when conceiving the revival and his overall plan, Russell didn't want to confuse new viewers by presenting people with a regeneration at the start of the very first episode. There were attempts to show the 8th Doctor's regeneration in the expanded media, specifically the 8th Doctor comic story The Flood, where 8 would have lost a battle with the Cybermen and regenerated into the 9th Doctor. Now, this was early in the revival's development, so the Time War backstory presumably did not yet exist, and the regeneration's inclusion was ultimately omitted, and we would then have to wait until 2013 with the 50th anniversary and the short minisode Night of the Doctor to see how the 8th Doctor truly concluded his time in the universe. Okay, so let's take a look into this alternate timeline, one where instead of hiring a new actor, Russell instead approached Paul McGann and asked him to reprise his role as the 8th Doctor on screen for the revival. Now, McGann had not been given a proper chance to play the Doctor on screen and make the role his own, and by this point had only just started doing voice work with Big Finish as his version of the character, and that, combined with the unproduced US continuation, I think would likely make him say yes, along with hearing what Russell of course had planned for the first series. With that out of the way, what would the 8th Doctor's look be in the revival? Well, that's also a question worth answering. Would we have a TV movie-esque look, or something closer to Night of the Doctor? Well, I actually think seeing something close to the 8th Doctor's updated look in Dark Eyes, along with the updated sonic screwdriver, would definitely be something worth seeing. Though, of course, this wouldn't be the actual Dark Eyes look, because that didn't get designed and sort of conceived until 2013, I think, or maybe a little before that. So I think we would have something similar to the 9th Doctor, but with a bit more McGann flair, if that makes any sense. Okay, that then brings us to the companions. Now, in this alternate timeline, I think Billie Piper would still have been cast as Rose Tyler, and Noel Clarke would have still been cast as Mickey. Now, I bring up Mickey because I definitely think, what with 8 not having the same attitude and sarcasm as 9, that he and Mickey would have a different relationship, and I think it's entirely possible that Mickey himself could, and probably would, have joined Rose as part of the TARDIS team. Now, the next question I'm sure a lot of people have is, would the backstory for the revival be the same if we were to use McGann instead of Eccleston? Now, that's actually something worth looking at as well. Now, we know that in the established canon that the 8th Doctor refused to get involved in the conflict between the Daleks and the Time Lords, stating that he would help where he could, but he would not directly fight. Side note, whilst not directly discussed on screen, a popular fan theory states that Jonah Bevan, a one-off character from the Torchwood episode Adrift, may have actually been rescued by the 8th Doctor off-screen, but again, this is not directly discussed. Anyway, I think that the Time War in narrative would have still happened. I also believe that the Doctor would eventually have no other choice but to get involved in the Time War. Now, I believe in this timeline, whilst not regenerating, I think the 8th Doctor would have gone through a majority of the War Doctor's adventures, at least in this version of events, which are also well documented. So in this timeline, essentially imagine most of the War Doctor's adventures in the expanded media, because that's what we got to flesh out his run, but with the 8th Doctor in place of that. I know 8 already has his own run of stories during the Time War, but I think in this timeline that would have been more extended because of the gap between the TV movie and the start of Modern Who. Anyway, I think this would still lead to the same original outcome that we got with the war, where the 8th Doctor steals the moment and uses it to end the war for good, just without any regenerations occurring during this time frame. This would leave us with a lot of the same events in the story, the Time Lords and the Daleks nearly wiped out altogether, along with the Doctor dealing with survivor's guilt. That and the burden of having been responsible to end the war. However, this also raises another question of what I believe is of vital importance. What about the War Doctor? Well, quite simply, I believe in this timeline that the War Doctor would never have existed and would not have come into being. Now, in narrative, the 8th Doctor would have been the one to have fought in the entirety of the Time War, but out of the narrative, there wouldn't be any room in sort of the entire Time War gap to place another incarnation of the Doctor, as by this point we'll have had some big finished material with 8 and he carries over into the new series, meaning that the War Doctor would likely never have been written, and by the time the events of the 50th anniversary come around, again, there wouldn't be any need for the War Doctor, despite how amazing the late John Hurt was in portraying him. Now, out of narrative, yet again I know, the War Doctor was created in response to Christopher Eccleston opting to not return for the 50th, due to the time he spent working on the show. But assuming we would end up with Tennant and eventually Smith in this timeline, the War Doctor would have simply been swapped out for Paul McGann, as he was technically the de facto quote-unquote War Doctor in this timeline. But what about the events of Series 1 and the eventual regeneration and parting of the ways? Well, again, that's actually more simple than you might think. So the events of Rose would play out as they did, and the Doctor would bring her along for a trip, so the events of the End of the World and Unquiet Dead would also remain unchanged. Come Aliens of London and World War III, which would still remain the same, at least until the end of World War III, I think due to his bravery in helping save the world, the Doctor would invite Mickey on board the TARDIS. This would then bring us onto the event of Dalek, where I think 8 would have a similar reaction to 9 in the OG timeline, infuriated that a single Dalek survived in this world, when his entire species, to his knowledge at the time, were all dead. Following on from that, we then move to the events of the Long Game, where I'm going to make another change. For this story, I'm going to replace Adam Mitchell with Mickey, who in this timeline wouldn't be as reckless as Adam or his original timeline counterpart. Mickey would depart the TARDIS after this, wanting to take a break from the travelling, which then brings us to the Empty Child and the Doctor Dances, where we would see the 8th Doctor meeting Captain Jack. Now, I think the events of this story again would remain unchanged, because while we would have a different Doctor, the overall outcome of the story would remain the same. Then Boomtown happens, but Mickey doesn't feel as left out because he's seen what's out there in the universe, so his romance with Rose I think would still continue here. Come Bad Wolf and Parting of the Ways, however, is where things start to change a little. The Doctor, with Jack's help, would still rescue Rose from the Daleks, and I think would lead the troops into battle. I believe in this timeline the Doctor wouldn't actually use the Delta Wave because that would result in too many casualties, and the situation would be similar to the Time War. He would defeat the Daleks but kill more innocent lives in the process, and likely end up sacrificing himself. Even without the Delta Wave, the Daleks I think would still get to the Doctor, and the TARDIS would then still return with Rose Tyler, now possessed by the Bad Wolf entity, and she defeats the Emperor and his Dalek forces along with the resurrecting Jack. So that part of the timeline remains the same, because given how vital Jack is from this point on in the timeline, I think we should keep that point the same. So from here, the 8th Doctor would absorb the energy of the time vortex from Rose, which inevitably leads to the regeneration, only this time we would end up with Christopher Eccleston instead of David Tennant, because this would be 8 regenerating into 9 instead of 9 regenerating into 10. However, that's where I'm going to end this what if scenario, simply because this is one of those ideas that leads to a lot of events changing in the timeline. But that does bring this video to a close. What do you think the Russell T Davies era, at least the first one, would look like if Paul McGann reprised his role as the 8th Doctor instead of the new casting of Christopher Eccleston? In the meantime, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay updated for future content. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you very soon.
But probably not the one you expected.
Doctor is happy. 50!
Bye, Davros. It hasn't been pleasant.
I serve notice on you.